All right, I wanted to hop on here again and talk about a pretty hot topic right now in the sports medicine, physical therapy, rehabilitation world, and that is whether or not you should ice. And, I was actually pretty surprised that I saw this. I thought, always the question was, should you ice or heat, which to address that one's pretty simple. The rule of thumb is that you should always follow heat by ice when you're in doubt, right? And you want to, stay away from the heat when you're in the early, what we would call the acute phase. Then the subacute phase where you're kind of in the middle, gets a little cloudy. And that's kind of why we go with that rule of thumb where it's like no heat at the beginning. And then if you're going to heat when you're not sure, especially during that subacute phase, you definitely want to follow with ice. And then eventually you could get rid of the ice and just use heat, or vice versa, depending on what you want out of it. When it comes to icing, then the topic of rehab, primarily we're looking at pain control and controlling swelling, which for all injuries, swelling is a big issue, probably one of the biggest issues because of what it physiologically does to the body. It typically causes a problem with our muscles and our neuromuscular system called reflex inhibition, especially at the knee, which is what causes the quad to shut down after somebody hurts their knee, especially after an ACL tear or a patellofemoral dislocation. You dislocate your kneecap. So it's really the swelling that is the issue. So now there's been kind of a new push towards this idea of not icing. And it started, I guess, with the original guy that published the data on RICE, right? Rest, ice, compression, and elevation, kind of retracted his statement and said, well, no, look, icing isn't the most important thing here. We need to get early mobilization and get early movement, which that concept's been around for a long time, right? The sooner that we can get people moving, the better. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't ice, right? I mean, that logically doesn't make any sense. So why would we then say, okay, then we shouldn't ice? Well, there's also some studies that show that possibly ice can slow down the healing process, kind of similar to what you look at or what you see when somebody takes anti-inflammatories. It actually kind of blunts some of the healing process that's going on, right? And also, when you look at what ice does, it's really a vasoconstrictor, right? So you have blood vessels, they get, cut off or squeezed down, if you want to think of it that way, versus what vasodilation is when the blood vessels open up and you allow more blood flow to the area, right? So as you have swelling going on, the thought was, well, if you can restrict those blood vessels, then it's going to stop the swelling. Well, basically when you take the ice away, the swelling kind of comes back. But there's a lot to be said for icing. And when I was first going into the University of Cincinnati, I, got really exposed to some good research at the time that they were looking at what's called the Game Ready, which is a pneumatic compression device, very similar to what we see with people that have lymphedema, that might have a mastectomy from breast cancer or somewhere along those lines, or people have issues with their legs as well, where you get people call it elephantitis, right? And the way to get rid of that is to use basically sequential compression garments, which the idea is if you use an ACE wrap, which is really uneven, on somebody that has lymphedema, it creates all these pockets and it doesn't really uniformly compress the tissue and doesn't allow you to get rid of the swelling. So these guys were doing research on this new device at the time when I was in Cincinnati. It had already been out, but it had been still pretty new, where you combined the vasopneumatic compression with ice or with cold. And the thought was is that you could basically kill two birds with one stone, which ultimately the research showed that it was a significant benefit to do icing and compression at the same time. But that also didn't mean that we were going to be like, oh, okay, well, that's all you're going to do. You're not going to do your exercises, or you're not going to do any movement. But we want to make sure that we're getting that swelling and that edema and that effusion down, because it further compromises the situation. Edema and swelling can also limit the actual physiology in terms of the healing inside the joint of what's called your synovial tissue or your synovial lining. You can end up, if you have chronic swelling in your knee, again, especially after a surgery, you can end up with what's called synovitis. And synovitis can be, a big problem. It can lead to arthritis, and sometimes you have to have surgeries to get the tissue removed. And, it's nothing that anybody wants to go through. But what does ice do then if it's not necessarily reducing swelling? Well, it reduces pain. And, from my standpoint, you got to look at, pain is a big problem for people, and most people are turning to quick fixes like, pharmacological, answers and medications like pain meds, right? And if you look in most baseball players or a lot of athletes, otherwise, but I say baseball because I think most people that have played baseball or know baseball players know that almost every guy has a bottle of Advil in their bag because they're trying to basically deal with the pain that they're having in their elbow or their shoulder or whatever it is, typically from throwing. So ice, if all that it does is decrease pain, that allows people to be in less pain and then potentially also be able to move their body a little bit better, right? So if they start feeling a little bit more confident, they can do a little bit more movement that we're looking for. So I still think that ice is really relevant, especially when it comes to muscle memory, and those type of concepts. When you have repetition and volume, we want to get rid of that antalgic, limping pain pattern as quickly as possible, and then we can manage the swelling with compression and movement and all of those other things that go along with the actual effusion. So I hope that was helpful. Again, this has been one of these things along the lines of the same thing as pain science that, I'm like, where did this even come from? But, like I mentioned in one of the last videos, right? If somebody is talking in absolutes and saying that you have to do this or this is the one quick fix solution, they're not coming at you with the black belt mentality, because we have to stay open and be able to assess the situation and use our evaluation based protocol to try to determine exactly what we need to do, when we need to do it, and how we are going to do it. And it's more of an art than a science with that sometimes, and a lot of people don't realize that there's a difference between science and applied science. Science is gravity and electricity, those things, they exist, how the cellular mechanisms work, right? But applied science is how we take the understanding of science and use it and apply it for you and to change the world, really. So, and sometimes we get to do that one person at a time, or you see some big huge innovation and change, which is awesome. All right, thanks a lot. Talk to you soon. Check you later. Bye.